Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and with me, as always, is the indescribable, unnameable Michael Whitehouse. How the flippin' heck are you, Mike?
You just named me. Okay, I get it. I'm good, my friend. I am good. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I've just been working away. Well, showing up to work, anyway.
I admire your dedication.
I've got some holidays coming up soon, so that'll be nice. I'm not going to say where or when exactly until after I get back, because I don't want to get robbed. It's not a beach holiday, that's all I'll say. It's the sort of place that might inspire some future episodes of this podcast. That's all I'll say.
Oh, nice. Lovely. So what you're saying is that a thief could be listening to this and say, hey, Martin's a way out. Now I can steal his computer.
Exactly. You never know the people who listen to these kinds of weird podcasts, Mike.
And his collection of strangely shaped potatoes.
Those aren't potatoes. Anyway, it feels like this year's just been racing past, man. I think I spent most of it working on this episode, so it'll be good to finally get this one out. In this episode, or in this two-parter, I should say, we're going to be discussing a series of very nasty crimes. Crimes that have seared themselves into the Glasgow psyche. These are the Barrowland killings, better known as the work of Bible John, and probably the most infamous as yet unsolved serial murder case in Scotland. This series of crimes captured the nightmares of the country and triggered the biggest investigation in Scottish criminal history. This is a very local case for us, Mike.
Yeah.
We both live within a few miles of where these crimes took place. We're very familiar with most of the locations, and that, I think, makes it, certainly to me, all the more disturbing. These terrible, outlandish things happening in such a familiar place really brings it home.
I was just round the other side of the bar as opposite of it at St. Luke's for that No Sleep podcast show. And
oh, yeah.
You know, I was thinking about that when I was standing there, how kind of eerie it is to think kind of what went on in that area.
Yeah, and it's just right there. It's not like something that you hear about happening in some exotic far-off place, or quite often when you hear about cases with serial killers, they happen in America or they happen down in England somewhere. This is something that happened right on our doorstep in places where we might go any day of the week. So yeah, that's what brings it so close to home for us.
Yeah.
Hopefully our own local knowledge will bring a little something to the table here as well. Now, we haven't done a serial killer episode till now. We may do more after this. It might become a regular thing. We'll see how it goes. This case is shrouded in mystery, with lots of very bizarre details, multiple suspects, a lot of intrigue, and it's just surrounded by so many weird and chilling anecdotes that I think makes it perfect Talking Till Dawn fodder. However, a word of warning before we begin. We're going to be discussing some extremely cruel and shocking events and the real deaths of real people. So this isn't going to be one of our more light-hearted episodes.
Absolutely not.
We always try to bring humour and warmth to a subject, but this isn't really a topic that lends itself particularly well to that. I mean, we still will, but it's not going to be laugh a minute. Basically what I'm coming to is, if you feel like you're likely to be distressed by topics involving murder, sexual assault, and other violent crimes, if anatomical detail bothers you, I recommend you give this episode a miss. Maybe check out some of our other folklore episodes or something. I do think there is value in discussing these kinds of events, in trying to understand them, in learning how to protect ourselves, in spreading awareness to perhaps, I'm not saying we're going to do this, but in general, spreading awareness to maybe help find answers to unsolved crimes, and in telling the victims' stories as well. However, these subjects are not for everyone. We totally get that. And we care about you guys. We want you to be happy and well. If you feel you need support at any time, there are people out there you can speak to. We'll put some links and numbers in the notes. So that out of the way, tonight we're in Talking Till Dawn's home city of Glasgow in Scotland. And we're heading back, first of all, to Monday the 18th of August, 1969. The summer that would become known as the Summer of Love. It's an era that tends to conjure up images of hippies and skinny dipping and drug mystics and peace and harmony. And in fact, Mike, across the sea in Bethel, New York, Woodstock, the original Woodstock Festival, is still ongoing this very day. The 18th of August was the final day of that festival.
It's kind of strange thinking of those kind of that iconic event.
Yeah.
And for us and people living in Scotland, for a very different reason,
another
what
iconic
with
event.
Bible John
Yeah.
is iconic.
Yeah, definitely. You tend to think of history as happening, these events happening in isolation, and sometimes when those comparisons are brought to mind, they seem really strange. Like did you know that the oldest pub in Ireland is older than the Aztecs?
No.
Yeah, that's another really weird one. Like, the Aztecs weren't as long ago as people think, so the Aztecs would have been about the 10th, 11th century, something like that, or maybe a little bit later. And the oldest pub in Ireland is well over 1,000 years old.
Still open.
Yeah, and it's still open. So, but there was another side to the peace and love era. While all that did happen, you have to remember that the 60s counterculture was a reaction to the dominant culture of the time, which by and large was still quite conservative and puritanical, especially by today's standards. And there was a lot of really dark shit going on under the surface, especially in this transitionary period between the 60s and 70s. There is a real undercurrent of violence and darkness and even a kind of existential dread. At this very moment in time, the Troubles are flaring up again in Northern Ireland with rioting and running battles between Republican and Ulster Loyalist factions. Vietnam and the Cold War are both in full swing. The shadow of nuclear Armageddon hangs over everything. Just 1 week prior to the events on this date, a pregnant Sharon Tate and 6 others were brutally murdered in Los Angeles by members of the Manson family. And in Bridgeton, in Glasgow's East End, a young woman named Margaret O'Brien is frantically searching the streets.
When I was a kid, one of the films that influenced me when I was starting to think about telling horror stories and things like that was Dance of the Vampires, or it's also called The Fearless Vampire Killers. And it's a Roman Polanski film, and it's got Sharon Tate in it. And she's, without trying to objectify anyone, she really was one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. And to see, long after that, I found out about the Manson crimes when I was older. Yeah. And it was really shocking to me. But anyway, sorry, that's an aside.
It brings it back home. It's someone you've seen and recognise, and you didn't know that they were dead when you watched the film, and then when you found out that she was murdered, it's like you discovered someone you knew was murdered. I guess, you know, that kind of in the order of the events of which you experienced.
It was kind of shocking. There's also I think sometimes when it's someone so vibrant as well, and you find out that they've been snuffed out like that, it kind of, I think psychologically your brain can't really process that.
And there's going to be a lot of that in this episode, Mike.
Good, that's great. Looking forward to it.
2 nights before Margaret O'Brien is searching the streets, on Saturday the 16th of August, Margaret's 32-year-old sister Jemima MacDonald, a popular, sociable, newly single woman with 3 children, had planned to go on a night out with friends to the Barrowland Ballroom, a famous dance hall in the nearby district of Calton. As fully fledged 30-somethings ourselves, Mike, with all the responsibilities and adulting that comes with that, and you now with a child of your own.
I'm just barely hanging on to the 30-something thing, but thanks for including me.
You're in there, mate. You're still there. I'm sure we can appreciate how much someone in her position would have looked forward to an occasional carefree night out on the town. The sad thing is that in a lot of reports of this, especially from the time, you can detect a subtly judgmental tone. The unmarried mother angle is given a lot of prominence, and I think that's quite unfair to cast any negative aspersions on Jemima. As far as I'm concerned, good for her that she was able to take care of her kids and have a social life. It seems to me she was doing her best, and what was to befall her was terrible misfortune and a horrendous, horrendous crime. Margaret and Jemima lived in tenement flats, apartments essentially, if you don't know what a tenement is, just across the hall from one another. So they had an arrangement whereby if one of the pair had an appointment or was going out for the evening, they would leave their kids with the other sister to babysit them. And this is what happened on the Saturday evening when Jemima went out to the Barrowlands. But come Sunday morning, Jemima still hadn't returned. Margaret didn't immediately panic. She knew that sometimes Mima stayed over at friends. Perhaps she was, feeling a bit worse for wear. Or heck, maybe she'd met a guy, right? The younger people listening should probably understand that before mobile phones, before people were constantly connected to one another, people were a lot more comfortable being out of contact with each other than we are today. So this sort of thing did happen, a lot more than we'd be comfortable with now. It wasn't like today where people would be phoning her right away and leaving messages and Facebook and friends and freaking out. It might have bothered them, but they just went about their Sunday. Jemima's kids spent the day with their auntie. Everyone just assumed she would show up later in the evening. But now Monday morning has arrived, and there's still no sign of Jemima. Now Margaret is concerned. The Waynes are upset, as of course they would be. This really isn't Jemima's style. Margaret contacts the police to declare her sister missing, and then hits the streets herself to look for Jemima. Now, Bridgeton, where the two sisters lived, is only about 4 or 5 blocks from the Barrowlands ballroom.
Yeah.
So she goes on foot, she's looking around, she's canvassing neighbours, talking to the friends, trying to put together who last saw Mima on Saturday night and where she might have gone. In the course of this, she happens to pass by a group of children playing in the street. Children could play unsupervised in those days without every adult in a 5-mile radius having an anxiety attack.
Even when I was a kid.
Yeah. I used to run around like fields and forests, and
yeah,
you wouldn't think of letting kids do that now, but it was great.
No, kids are like driven from point A to point B.
Yeah.
Completely all the time. But when I was a kid, it was like you headed out, you were just kind of roaming the streets and running around fields and probably getting into mischief.
Exactly. Well, as we'll see, the life of these kids couldn't be much further from the life of kids today. By sheer chance, Margaret overhears these kids talking about something they found the previous day in a condemned tenement, a building on McKeith Street, only about 20 yards from the front door of the building where the sisters lived. Something the children refer to as the body. Now, I think you can see where this is going. Grim as it is, this is what my mind goes to now when I see footage of Jimi Hendrix playing Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. This was all going down about the same time, if that helps you place this within history.
That's awful. You've just ruined that concert footage for me now forever. Thanks.
Well, it's maybe a couple of hours before he took to the stage, so the aftermath of this would be going on when he's on stage. So the children led Margaret to the building. I don't even dare to imagine how the woman must have been feeling at that moment. The kind of courage it must take someone to walk through a door expecting to find that. She must have been praying it was the kids' imaginations running away with them, that it was some mistake.
Yeah.
It wasn't a mistake. Jemima was there, face down, discarded. Her face had been beaten to a pulp, and she had been garroted. Her body was still dressed, but her underwear was ripped. Her shoes and her tights had been placed at her side. A post-mortem examination would later determine that she had been raped and then strangled with her own stockings. It also determined that she had been menstruating at the time. This detail, personal as it is, would prove to be an important one, because police had seen this before. She was not the first woman killed in the city. In similar circumstances, who had been menstruating at the time of her death. She was not the first to have been strangled and beaten and dumped carelessly among the streets of Glasgow. She was not the first to have gone missing following a night out at the Barrowland ballroom. And she would not be the last. Now, Glasgow has always been something of a city of two faces, and that was even truer in the 60s and 70s than it is now. I do feel that as a Glaswegian, as an adopted Glaswegian, the city gets a bad rap. Glasgow is, and was even then, a cosmopolitan, international, cultural city. A city of museums and galleries, known worldwide for its universities, its art school, its astonishingly vibrant music scene. It has long been a centre for scientific and architectural and technological invention. It's one of the financial services centres of Europe, and for over a century, it was one of the most, if not the most, important maritime industrial centre in the British Commonwealth, or the Empire as it was. That said, I'm conscious that the events we're talking about tonight are ones that take us to a dark time when the city was absolutely rife with violence and poverty and dereliction. To give you an international point of comparison, Glasgow in the late 60s, early 70s, really up until the 1980s, had certain things in common with somewhere like Detroit around the time that city's industrial decline began to kick in. There were differences, but some of the results were similar. So I'm conscious that parts of this story do reinforce this old, now outdated image, which would be a complete disservice, so I thought I ought to qualify this by saying that Glasgow today, at least the parts you're likely to encounter as a visitor, is a beautiful city full of culture and friendly people. It's an amazing place for a city break or to work and study. Please don't feel put off by the bleak picture we're painting here.
Yeah.
Glasgow is not what it was.
But like every city, really, it still has its problems and places, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But
Glasgow still has vast areas of poverty and social problems, but it has continually improved over the decades from the time we're talking about. In 1968 and 1969, when these horrible crimes were committed, Glasgow's vast shipbuilding industries were just beginning to feel the squeeze. The city, even at this stage, was still kind of suffering the effects of the Second World War. Glasgow, and even more so some of the wider areas of Greater Glasgow, such as Clydebank, were intensely bombed by the Luftwaffe during the war. The area's heavy industry had made it a huge target. Even in the late 1960s, there were scars remaining, patches of undeveloped waste ground still marked the landscape here and there, where bombs and incendiaries had obliterated buildings, businesses, families. The local authorities were then in the process of moving much of the urban population out of the inner areas of the city, which contributed to the dereliction as empty buildings were left aside to await redevelopment or were knocked down, and in some cases lay idle for years, hence why you had all these condemned buildings lying around. But like I say, we've gone back 18 months before Jemima MacDonald's murder, because Jemima MacDonald was not the first. On the 22nd of February 1968, a young auxiliary nurse named Patricia Docker was herself getting ready for a night out on the town. Patricia was 25 years old, a mother of one, and she had recently separated from her husband. He was an RAF corporal stationed in Lincolnshire, and it seems things had been rocky between them for a while when they made the decision to separate. Patricia returning to Glasgow with her 4-year-old son and moving back in with her parents. As with Jemima, Patricia arranged for family to take care of her child that night. Her mum and dad were to babysit young Sandy while she went out to, as she told her parents, the Majestic Ballroom on Hope Street in the city centre. Patricia didn't end up at the Majestic Ballroom. I should probably give a bit of background on the ballroom scene of Glasgow in the late mid-20th century. First of all, although these were similar to nightclubs, they weren't exactly nightclubs as we'd recognise them today, where you've got a DJ playing recorded music. The disco was still in its infancy in 1968. It hadn't really come to Britain. The main difference is that these ballrooms were almost entirely based around live music. There would be a house band probably playing a mixture of jive, soul, R&B, big band, maybe some upbeat rock and roll like Chubby Checker and that kind of thing, although you wouldn't call these rock venues as such, right back to old-fashioned waltzes, tangos and foxtrots. The Barrowlands, by the way, is still a major venue today, although it's more of a place for gigs now than a ballroom proper. I've been to many a gig at the Barrows, actually.
Yeah, that's why it's famous. That's why it's famous as a venue.
Even today, it's still, and you will be able to back me up on this, Mike, it still has that very characteristic shabby, rundown, frayed around the edges glamour that only a place almost unchanged since the 60s.
I mean, I remember, not really that long ago, maybe about 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago maybe, they were talking about shutting it down. And I remember there was like a huge uproar about it, but...
It's an institution.
Yeah.
So, the exterior of the Barras building, it's not in the best area of the city. The Barras is a street market area that has declined a lot over the years. The building itself It's all the architectural appeal of like a nuclear waste disposal facility or something.
It's strange, isn't it? When you step outside of
It's hideous.
having seen that your whole life,
Uh-huh.
you do look at it and you realise, because when I was at St. Luke's and I was standing across from it, St. Luke's is beautiful, it's this old church venue, but it's across the road from the Barrowlands. I was looking at the Barrowlands and I was just thinking about all these people involved with the No Sleep Live show coming across.
You're trying to block their view of the Barrowlands.
And there's the Barrowlands with this, it's got this really unbelievable neon sign.
Okay, picture this, right? It's this big, grey, industrial-looking box covered in, like, heating vents and grimy tiles, dysentery-coloured rough casting. Except on top of that, as Mike says, it's got this glitzy 25-foot-high landmark neon sign advertising itself.
Yeah.
Genuinely Vegas-style signage stuck to an absolute turd of a building.
It's the only place in Glasgow that's got... The only other thing, I think, did the Grand Old Opry used to have one?
Yeah, it's got
like
Grand
that.
Old Opry's got stuff
But
like
maybe
that.
not as big.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of neon signs in Glasgow, but nothing on that scale. I mean, inside, though, as we've said, it's a different story. It still has all the beautiful retro wooden fittings and paneling and painted ceilings. It's a very unique, atmospheric, timeless kind of place. So you go to a concert at the Barrowlands nowadays, and all you're missing is like maybe the house band, definitely the clouds of cigarette smoke that you don't get anymore, but you could easily be back in the 60s. But back then, the ballrooms weren't the kind of place you just roll up to at midnight because the pubs were closing and you fancied another few drinks. For one, they mostly closed around midnight, and people actually went there to dance. A lot of nightclubs now are like glorified, expensive bars that happen to have a dance floor, but you wouldn't even go to one of these dance halls unless you wanted to dance. Dancing was an incredibly popular pastime in Glasgow at that point in history. It crossed social class, it crossed generations. Some of these places weren't just open in the evening. The National Library of Scotland's Moving Image Archive has footage shot at the Barrowlands Ballroom in the 1960s, and in that you can see the house band playing to an audience, a mixed audience of adults, children, and young teenagers, presumably during the day. Lots of these venues would open for daytime sessions, like the equivalent of a matinee movie. Family members might spend an afternoon together at the dancing, or if parents wanted some alone time, they might give the kids some money and send them out to have a dance, same as they might send them out to the pictures. In some ways, I don't know, I mean, I think it's kind of a shame that we've lost that kind of family aspect to dance places.
It sounds very kind of wholesome.
Yeah. It's not to say that it was all squeaky clean, family-friendly fun, though. The daytime scene was very different from the nighttime scene. At nighttime, some of these venues had a reputation for gang violence. And if you've got a place that attracts youths from varied backgrounds, some from deprived neighbourhoods that might have territorial or sectarian rivalries, there's probably going to be trouble sooner or later. Glasgow had a huge problem with knife crime at that time. There were plenty of stabbings and slashings and even cases of pitched battles breaking out on dance floors.
Just to, as a little aside, because we talked about this before when we were talking about doing an episode on Bible John, and that is that my mum and dad were frequenting these places at that time. Don't worry, they weren't Bible John. But, you know, they were going to these places at that time.
Wow. Well, they might have seen them, they might have seen something and not know.
Well, I'll tell you something that did happen to my dad at the
Here we go.
Barrowlands. I'm sure it was at the Barrowlands. My dad had a scar running along the palm of his hand. This is just going to reinforce the negative image
Glasgow
of
stereotype.
Glasgow. But someone tried to stab his friend and he caught the knife. And it's always like that stayed with me.
That happened in the Barrowland?
Yeah.
Wow.
That sort of stuff was going on.
So,
Not as bad as he had a shotgun pulled on him once as well.
in the Barrowland?
No, not in the Barrowlands. It was down in the west side of the city in Maryhill.
Oh, right, shit.
He
Not far
was-
from where I live then.
Yeah, he grew up in Maryhill, and this is a total aside, but he was walking home one day, and he saw a guy that he knew. He wasn't like friends with this guy, but like kind of knew him, and he saw another two guys that he also knew in the area, but who were like hardmen, basically. People used to use that term. I don't know. They used to use it in Glasgow anyway. It was the local hardmen. You know, they were the kind of gangsters of the area, kind of. My dad knew two of them a little bit, one of them in particular. So my dad walked up to try and kind of intervene and be like, oh, listen, like, I know this guy, like, leave him alone. And one of the guys turned round and he had a shotgun.
Holy shit.
And he just said to my dad, Stuarty, keep walking. My dad did. My dad kept walking.
Shit. So there's a little flavour of the dark side of Glasgow in the 1960s then.
Yeah.
Jesus. More relevant, though, to the case of Bible John was the connection between some of these venues and raunchier, what the more puritanical people at the time would have called moral turpitude. We're talking about sex. And yeah, places where there's music and dancing and drinking are always going to be popular with people on dates or perhaps looking to meet someone new. But there were certain nights at certain dance halls that developed reputations for being places you might go if you were single and looking for a casual one-night stand, or not single and looking for a casual one-night stand, or if you were newly divorced or separated and trying to put yourself back out there in an era where divorce was still something that raised eyebrows. I'm not saying that everyone who went to those halls on those nights was looking for a quick hookup, but there was a kind of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas vibe to some of these events that allowed for that. One event that had that reputation was this over 25s night that was held on Thursdays and Saturdays in the Barrowland Ballroom, or as they were commonly known in the city, the Grab a Granny nights. Over 25s is Grab a Granny night. Don't know about you, Mike, but that makes me feel real good about my age.
Yeah, but it's different now, isn't it? It's like when you were 20, there was a social pressure to have already have children and be married at that point.
Yeah.
Whereas now,
exactly,
the average age for people to have kids is in their 30s. So it's very different.
Yeah. So these were nights catering specifically to a slightly older crowd. People who were sometimes a bit more, shall we say, thirsty. 18, 19-year-olds might have all the raging hormones, but especially at that time, as you say, Mike, when if you weren't married by 25, you'd have been thought of as leaving it pretty late. You're going to have a number of patrons who feel they don't have a lot of time to waste in finding someone. Also, a certain number of patrons who've decided maybe that settling down in monogamy is not their cup of tea. Some patrons who have been married and are now experienced divorcees who know what they're after and aren't as shy about it as a blushing youngster might be. And some patrons who are married but are looking for a bit of action on the side. Added to that, the majority of working class society, as we've mentioned, was still relatively traditional. So as a result, there were a lot of attendees who, if they were dancing with someone and were asked, "Hey handsome, what's your name?" they would use a pseudonym, a false name.
That's my chat-up line. Should say that was my chat-up line.
Yeah.
Happily married man, everyone.
And B, there were a lot of people who definitely wouldn't want to publicly admit that they were there on a given night to say they'd witnessed something. Both things that may well have had an impact on the investigation down the line. In fact, I'm positive they did. So when Patricia Docker told her mum and dad that she was going to the Majestic Ballroom that Thursday night in February 1968, it's quite possible that she was telling a wee white lie, that she'd been intending to go to the Barrowlands the whole time. Not that there was anything wrong with her going to the Barrowlands. She was separated from her husband. They were living apart. She was a single woman for all intents and purposes, and good for her. But we can envisage why someone in her position might not want to tell her parents where she's going. Alternatively, she may have gone to the Majestic for a little while and then changed her mind. Either way, the Barrowlands would be where Patricia Docker was last definitively seen alive. Early the next day, about 6 or 7 a.m. on a frosty winter's morning, a joiner by the name of Maurice Goodman was heading to start the day at his workshop, which was situated on Carmichael Lane in an area called Battlefield in Glasgow's south side. This is about 3 miles south of the Barrowlands, a slightly more salubrious area. It's not Beverly Hills, but I certainly wouldn't call it deprived, would you, Mike?
No. So Battlefield is where a college I used to go to is, and we were just looking at the maps where part of this case took place and just realised that where I used to go and grab a sandwich and then go and sit, it's round to the back of these, there's all these tenements off of this the main road, Battlefield Road, and I would go and sit there and eat my sandwich.
At this very place.
But it's very strange.
And we're about to find out why that's strange. We're about to find out why.
I think I can guess.
Carmichael Lane is probably a strange place to eat a sandwich.
Put that in a t-shirt. People would ask you, what does that mean? If you had a t-shirt that said Carmichael Place is a strange place to eat a sandwich.
It's a long story.
How many people would come up to you to ask, like, what is that about? Is that a band?
When Mr. Goodman arrives at his workshop, there's a problem. There's a naked body lying in the doorway. In the confusion of that moment, he's probably hoping this is some late-night partygoer who's cast off their clothes and passed out drunk in the street. Good luck to you if you're doing that in Glasgow in February, but he's surely hoping that's the case. He reaches out and pokes at the body with his foot. Describing it later, he said, "It was like touching a block of ice. I instinctively knew it was a dead person." Goodman raced home to phone the police. Strangely, he mistakenly described this body as that of a man. It's not clear how or why he would make that error. Patricia Docker was a feminine-looking lady. She was lying on her back, and she wasn't wearing any clothes, so certainly
That's unusual,
Goodman would have... Yeah, it's a strange thing.
Just the shock of the situation, and if he thought it was someone who was drunk, he might have associated that more with like a man at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly Goodman would have been completely shocked and confused at finding a dead body. That must have played into it. But it does actually underscore some of the stuff we were talking about in part 3 of our Loch Monster episodes about how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be, even with the best will in the world, particularly when something catches us unawares. Of course, tragically, this was Patricia. She'd been dumped almost in plain view, a very short walk from her own doorstep. Some degenerate had beaten this poor woman severely, very, very severely around the face and head, stripped her, and then strangled the life out of her, probably with a belt, before casually leaving her battered, naked body to be found by a member of the public. It sickens me, Mike. I mean, we're probably going to cover other serial crimes in future, and there have been lots of other serial killers, some more prolific, some whose crimes were more, whatever you want to call it, gory. But there's something about the Bible John killings that really makes me unhappy. There's something about the casual way these women were just cast aside in plain sight. Like, whoever did it was so blasé, he barely even cared enough to cover them or conceal them.
Yeah, and the fact that that plays into this being one of the most mysterious cases in Scottish history, it makes it even more sickening that someone could just be so brutal about human life, but could just be so, like you say, blasé about it, and
like it was nothing.
And still, to this day,
we don't know who it was.
Well, I don't know if that's a spoiler for people that don't know this case, but there are suspects, but it's still a mystery.
Yeah. I mean, I know that all serial killers care very little for their victims, otherwise they wouldn't do what they do. But there's a swagger, there's something so casual about the way Bible John tossed these women aside when he was done with them. Patricia was a human being. She had a whole life and dreams and a wee son, and it's a cliche, but she really did have her whole life in front of her. They all did. But it's like these women were just litter to him.
Yeah.
Patricia's clothes, her handbag, and her purse were missing from the scene. Her purse was later recovered by police divers searching the River Cart. The rest was never recovered.
I used to play along the River Cart. It cuts through a place called Lynn Park, and I used to go there when I was younger. I used to fish a little bit, although I don't do that now, but I remember fishing on the cart. And also there was an old abandoned mill,
right,
that had one of the, what do you call it, one of the water wheels.
Oh yeah.
It was like still intact, and we were just exploring Lynn Park one day, and we found that, and it was I always remember it being a really kind of eerie feeling, and I think in some ways that kind of plays into this, that these brutal crimes are in places that we know,
Yeah.
and how every place has a strange history, and it's a mix of great moments and nightmarish moments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have put it better itself. They have this whole history that we don't know about until we dig into them. But a key point with Patricia's body was that a used sanitary item was found placed near her body. Of course, this being the first murder, the full significance of that wouldn't be recognised until later. There was no clear evidence of rape, not in this first murder. There would be in the later killings. There's a bit of debate about this. Some of the investigators have stated that they believe Docker was raped, but it would seem no definitive evidence for that was found. Reading between the lines, it's always a gross subject to bring up, but I think what this boils down to is a lack of a sperm sample. That might mean that the assailant was disturbed while committing the crime, or, we don't know. But police...
Escalation as well.
That's very true.
Crimes become more... Well,
he becomes more comfortable doing it, yeah.
Yeah, and there are certain things, sometimes with serial killers, it's a case of that they're kind of pushing the door, they're just kind of... Or pushing the envelope, they're just trying something a little bit, and then more, and then they go over the edge. I think that maybe that's why, maybe the first victim, maybe he didn't...
Yeah, and who knows what he's been doing prior to this, and that element of it is something that I will touch on probably in the next episode. But you're right, there's always an escalation in these things, and we can see that escalation in the fact that there's 18 months between the first killing and the second killing, and not to spoil what's coming later, but there's only 2 months between the second killing and the third killing. What happened before the first killing? What was he doing then? We don't know, but there's some speculation. We will get to that. But that's a great point about escalation. I think he was becoming more comfortable as he went along. But police going door to door did find witnesses who had heard a woman screaming in the night and shouting, "Leave me alone." Poor woman must have been terrified. Awful, just awful. The witnesses had presumed it was people horsing around, which you probably would if you hear people shouting at night. I mean, I've heard people shouting in the middle of the night and you go, drunk people.
Yeah.
There were some unfortunate circumstances that conspired to make things difficult for the investigators on this, which would later become known as the first of Bible John's murders. First of all, the fact Patricia told her parents she was going to the Majestic and not the Barrowlands cost the detectives 3 days. They sank 3 days into tracking down and interviewing everyone who'd been at the Majestic ballroom before they discovered if she had been there, it was only briefly before moving on to the Barrowlands. 3 days is a long time in a murder investigation. The trail is already starting to grow cold. People's memories are no longer as fresh. As a result, there don't seem to have been any clear descriptions of who she'd been dancing with at the Barrowlands. On top of that, the alleyway where she was found wasn't locked down till well over an hour after the body was discovered. Now, yes, this is a time before DNA profiling. Procedures were very different. But it wasn't Whitechapel in the 1880s either. At this point, detectives were proficient in dealing with murder cases with a forensic approach. They had crime labs, they had fingerprinting and hair and fibre analysis and all that stuff. But how much of that training had filtered out to rank and file bobbies on the beat? Since Maurice Goodman's rather confused initial report had wrongly indicated this was the body of a male, possibly dead of exposure, the City of Glasgow police were not quick to race their homicide detectives to the scene. Some have said they were negligently slow to do so. Remember, this is the first victim. They don't know yet that they've got a maniac on their hands. They assumed that this was just another wino who drank himself to death, as you suggested already, Mike. As a result, the first police dispatched to the location were a couple of traffic officers who just happened to be working nearby. Now, I'm not questioning the competence of those officers. Well, these are two guys whose job is mainly focused on directing traffic and issuing tickets. They were not well practiced in dealing with a crime of this magnitude. And I believe these officers may have been working on foot. If so, they're not going to have to hand the resources needed to secure this kind of scene. They saw it was a woman's body, and to their credit, they did immediately recognise it as a very suspicious death. They noted the sanitary towel, and that a single woman's shoe lay nearby, and they did immediately send for detectives. But word spread fast, rubberneckers started flocking around the scene. I'm sure the two police had their hands full just keeping people away. And at a time when a footprint or a fibre from a sweater was a key piece of forensic evidence, all of these folk traipsing through the alley must have been a terrible contamination of the scene. When the scene was locked down and the body was being removed, one of the paramedics actually recognised Patricia as a nurse from a nearby hospital, and that would lead to her being positively identified.
What coincidence that is.
It was her father who had to go and see the body and give an identification.
Oh, man.
Poor guy, man. Poor guy. Professor Gilbert Forbes of the University of Glasgow carried out the post-mortem on Patricia. This confirmed that she died of strangulation, and also, based on the extent of rigor mortis, that she'd been in the lane for several hours. This means she was there since shortly after leaving the Barrowlands ballroom. Carmichael Lane is very near to Patricia's home and about an hour's walk or a 15-minute drive from the Barras. As this was the first of the deaths and there was very little information to go on, detectives at the time wouldn't have known for sure whether she was murdered by someone she met at the dancing or was randomly attacked on her way home. But with the benefit of hindsight, with knowledge of the later killings, we can say with some confidence that she met her killer at the Barrowlands ballroom that night. He probably offered to accompany her home before launching into a frenzied shock attack within yards of her front door. So, investigations were carried out, appeals for information were made. There weren't a lot of immediate suspects. They didn't have a description of the killer to work with. Patricia's estranged husband was looked into, but of course he was hundreds of miles away with a cast iron alibi. It seemed to be a one-off random attack, and gradually the case went cold. A year and a half would pass before the killer would strike again. With the murder of Jemima MacDonald, which we discussed at the start of the episode, the Docker murder had fallen out of the public eye by then. Press interest had long faded, and the inquiry had been scaled down. But when Jemima MacDonald was killed, when the second murder happened, and the similarities between the crimes were recognised, alarm bells began to ring in the City of Glasgow police force. Officially, they were treated as separate cases to begin with, but around this time the idea first occurs to Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie and his team at the CID that a habitual killer might be loose on the streets of Glasgow. Let's quickly remind ourselves of some of the similarities, okay? Both young women were killed after attending the Barrowlands ballroom. Both were mothers. Both were superficially similar in build with dark brown hair. Both had been savagely beaten around the face and head before being strangled with an improvised ligature. Both had been menstruating. Both had their own sanitary items placed on or near their bodies. The handbags of both women were taken, and both were dumped just barely out of sight, very close to their own homes. Unlike Patricia, however, Jemima never made any secret of the fact that she was going to the Barrowlands, so this time police were very quick to obtain statements from both staff and patrons of the dance hall. In fact, Jemima had been a regular there, she had friends there. She'd been seen and spoken to by several acquaintances, people with clear memories of that night. And from these witnesses emerged the first descriptions of a suspect. Jemima was seen dancing and spending most of the evening with a tall, well-dressed young man between 25 and 35 with brown hair with fair or reddish streaks, which caused him to stand out somewhat because it was cut unfashionably short for the late 1960s. One detail described by a witness who had been around Jemima and her potential killer that night, a detail that wasn't reported on at the time but would take on a different dimension later, was that they thought they heard this man, who spoke with a Glasgow accent but was very well spoken, dropping short biblical quotations into his conversation with Jemima. The pair were later seen leaving the dance hall together, and another witness reported seeing them walking together on London Road at about midnight. They were heading in the direction of McKeith Street where Jemima lived, and where her sister would later find her dead in that abandoned tenement. Later, just as in the case of Patricia Docker, neighbours on McKeith Street would report hearing a woman's screams in the middle of the night. Now, one peculiarity of Scots law was that until that time, and I didn't know this, Mike, it was prohibited to publish the image of a suspect prior to their arrest.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not clear.
Like a photo fit or a drawing?
Exactly. Yeah, you weren't allowed to do that. I'm not clear on why that was. Possibly an archaic sort of preventative measure against vigilantism. Maybe there was a fear it might prejudice trials.
We should say as well that Scotland is quite an old country, so there are probably, or there were probably, laws that stemmed back quite a bit.
Yeah. Scotland has a separate legal system to the rest of the UK as well.
Yeah.
When it was absorbed into the United Kingdom of Great Britain, it actually retained its own legal and educational system, so there's certain parts of the Scottish establishment that are still distinct from the rest of the UK. And a lot of these laws are very, very different to the ones south of the
That's why
border.
as well, I mean, I'm sure some of our listeners will have watched other, true crime documentaries and things like that, and some of those documentaries, I can't remember if it was Making a Murderer or if it was The Staircase. I think it was The Staircase, actually, that documentary, and they made a big push for the person who was accused to try and get what they call the Scottish verdict, which
Not
is
proven.
so it's like a third option to guilty and not guilty.
Yeah.
And that's something that comes from Scottish law or the criminal justice system, but there have been precedents in like American law where under certain circumstances people can,
Or an equivalent to that decision, yeah.
I think they can take something like that. It's almost as if they're unofficially admitting to it
Right.
for the family's sake. But then I might be wrong about that, but that's what I remember in The Staircase, that there was a big part about that. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. In any case, DSBT and his team sought special permission from the Procurator Fiscal. That's kind of the Scottish equivalent of the US Attorney's Office or the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales, to be allowed for the first time to publish an artist's impression of the suspected killer. And for the first time in Scottish history, that request was granted. And now it's commonplace that happens. But this was the first
That's
time.
amazing. I didn't know that was where that came from.
So the police hired Lennox Patterson, a distinguished illustrator, designer and printmaker, to produce the likeness. And soon the face of the Barrowland Killer was emblazoned across every newspaper in the land. Police also staged a reconstruction of Jemima MacDonald's walk from the dance hall to McKeith Street, with a woman police constable standing in for Jemima. And this was televised in the hopes that some witnesses might have their memories jogged, but unfortunately, nothing substantial came of that. Uniformed police became a common sight on the floor of the Barrowland Ballroom. The venue was now a focus of their patrols. Sometimes they would even take to the stage between songs to appeal for information, but that didn't have any result except to reduce attendance, because, nobody wants to get a lumber in a room full of police taking notes, I guess. Almost unbelievably, the one person the police presence did not deter was the Barrowlands Killer. On Halloween 1969, 2 months after Jemima MacDonald's death, he took another victim from the dance hall, victim number 3, seemingly from right under the noses of police. Helen Puttock was a 29-year-old mother of 2, and she had a number of other similarities to the Barrowland Killer's previous victims. She was a military wife, just like Pat Docker. She was a sociable and outgoing woman who enjoyed dancing. She was a fashionable dresser with short brown hair. One difference was that Helen was not estranged from her husband. She had, for a time, lived with George Puttock at his postings with the Corps of Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers on a base in Germany. And while there might have been occasional fireworks, I don't think we can say they were unhappy in their relationship, but it would seem she found that life quite lonely. And a lot of military spouses do. We don't know the full details of Helen's situation, but especially back then, the wife of an army officer living on a base, you probably don't have a job of your own. You're away from your family, you're away from the established friend networks that help you feel like an independent person. You might feel you were just there as this appendage of your husband. certainly can't fault someone for not enjoying that. So Helen and George agreed that she would move back to Glasgow with the kids until George could get a new posting closer to home. They remained in a long-distance relationship. They wrote letters, they spoke on the phone, and George would come to Glasgow to spend time with his family whenever he was on leave. And Helen's husband was, in fact, home on leave when she announced that she and her sister Jeannie had arranged to go out dancing that Thursday, the 31st of October 1969. This triggered what George would later call a tremendous fight. It seems he was unhappy she was going out dancing and leaving him to babysit while he was supposed to be home visiting her. I would assume he also knew the slightly raunchy reputation of the Barrowlands. Helen eventually talked him round. Look, it's not like I'm going out on the pool, I'm going with my sister, dancing's just what I like to do and I hardly ever get the chance because I have to watch the kids. Jeannie and her husband have an understanding where he gets to go out on nights out with his friends and she goes out with hers. And to us today, that certainly seems, I think, like a fairly normal relationship. A healthier level of trust, maybe. And I don't think we should take away from this that Helen and Jeannie were in any way wrong to step out together that night. For one, despite all the innuendo in the press, I don't believe for a moment that they had any intention of being unfaithful to their husbands. It might just be me being naive, but if you were to go out to cheat on your spouse, I don't think there's many folk would take a family member with them.
Yeah.
All I see here is two sisters out for a good time together. The husband being home meant the chance of a babysitter so they could get a rare night out dancing that they both loved doing. For two, I don't think any of them could have imagined the tragedy that this would all end in. Listen, serial killings are phenomenally rare. You can't live your life in constant fear of the 1 in a million bolt from the blue. You'd never cross the street, you'd never speak to anyone, you'd never get in a bus or a car, you'd never leave the house. Yes, there had been 2 killings linked to the Barrowlands at this point, but Glasgow was a rough and tumble city back then. You could be knifed by a mugger or hit by a drunk driver. Helen's mother did worry though, as mothers do, and she nagged them about the murders. Maybe they should go somewhere else, maybe they should stay in. Helen showed her mother her long fingernails and said, "Can you imagine anyone trying anything on me?" Her husband would later say, "She was strong physically. She always said no one could get the better of her." And that's a detail that we will come back to in the next episode, but for now, just remember that. She was a tough woman. Then, of course, you have the increased police presence and the ongoing manhunt. Surely the killer would be mad to show his face at the same dance hall so soon. So the 2 sisters hit the town. Helen wore a black dress, a fur coat, and a brown purse. They took a bus into town about 8 p.m. and met some friends in the Trader's Tavern for drinks before heading round to the Barrowlands ballroom. Jeannie and Helen hit the dance floor, and at a certain point, the 2 women fell into the company of a pair of guys, each introducing themselves as John. Afterwards, Jeannie would say that she didn't believe John was either man's real name, and in fact, she and Helen had laughed together at some point when they were briefly alone because they thought John was such a bullshit fake name to give. Jeannie assumed that certainly her John, the John she was spending most time talking to, and maybe both of them, were actually married men using pseudonyms, but she and Helen didn't really care. They were only interested in dancing anyway, they just thought it was funny. The John we're most interested in is, of course, what Jeannie referred to as Helen's John, the guy who seemed to be sniffing around Helen a lot. Now, I'm aware that the name John can have another connotation that obviously doesn't apply here. That's simply the name both men gave. Jeannie would later describe Helen's John as tall, clean-cut, well-manicured, very well-dressed, dressed a cut above the ballroom regulars, in fact, and yet there was something in his style that seemed anachronistic, slightly outmoded, like a sharp-dressed man slightly out of his time. He was wearing a brown suit with suede shoes, and definitely I'm no fashion historian, so I could be way off, but suede shoes are something I would associate more with the 1950s, maybe the very early 1960s. He was, outwardly at least, quite polite and proper, even chivalrous. He didn't drink that night, he didn't swear, he didn't laugh at dirty jokes, but there was something haughty and maybe rehearsed about his mannerisms. The other John, by comparison, was friendly and gregarious, but rough around the edges, so they were kind of opposites to each other, these two guys.
Did the two guys know each other?
No. The way in which the two men interacted suggested to Jeannie that they did not know each other. There has been a lot of speculation about this other John, but Jeannie was quite clear that she thought the two men had never met before that night. In fact, Jeannie's John, who we'll call Castle Milk John, as he happened to mention, he was from Castle Milk.
Another stomping ground, kind of, round the back where I grew up.
Castle Milk John confided in Jeannie that he didn't like the vibe he was getting from the other John, that he seemed aloof, he wouldn't make eye contact, acted shiftily, like he had something to hide. At one point, Castle Milk John speculated that the other man might be an undercover cop. Towards the end of the night, as everyone's making their way out, Jeannie stops at a vending machine to buy some cigarettes. Remember cigarette vending machines?
Oh yeah.
The machine swallows her money, but doesn't dispense the cigarettes. Helen's John, the weird John...
Raging. Absolutely raging.
Well, it's not his money, and it's not even the woman he's been speaking to most of the night, but he witnesses this, and he summons a manager, and then gives the manager and the bouncers a public dressing down in the lobby, demanding Jeannie be given a refund, and dropping the immortal line, "My father said these were dens of iniquity." Mike, I mean, you worked in nightclubs, right?
Yeah.
How many times did people get away with dressing down the manager and the bouncers publicly in the middle of the lobby?
Oh, no, you're out in your ear.
Yeah.
Unless, the only way you would ever get away with that, when I worked in nightclubs for about 4 years in Glasgow, the only way you would get away with something like that was if you were connected in some way.
That's an interesting insight.
That's the only way, is if they knew you, or knew someone you were connected to, and knew that if I fight fire with fire here, if I say get you chucked out or whatever, then that person's going to come round here and jump my head.
So Jeannie, like you, expects this guy to be thrown out by the bouncers for talking to the club manager that way. But there's something about his manner. He doesn't swear. He doesn't get flustered. Jeannie said it was like a school teacher speaking to a young child, which actually causes the manager to back down.
Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, weird. Based on this, Jeannie would later say that she felt Helen's John was someone used to handing out orders and having them obeyed.
She kind of saying as if it was almost like a sort of force of character, that, you know, some people are able to command respect off of people.
Force of character, and or that he was in a profession that involved talking to people like that. We'll come back to it, but might include things like the military or the police.
Yeah.
People who know how to get people in heated situations to comply.
Do you know what would be interested to know about that? Did he leave and go and get the manager?
I get the sense the manager was just around. It would be like a duty manager just standing around somewhere.
Yeah,
you know?
That makes sense. If it's the time where people are leaving, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's what would happen when we were working. There would always be a manager down at the front door. But
yeah,
what I mean by that is that if he went and got the manager, or went and got a bouncer, and said to the bouncer, "I'm such and such," or "I know such and such."
Police did interview the bouncers and stuff later, and they didn't know him. I guess unless they were covering for him, but I think in a case like this, they probably would have got some information out of him. But that is a good point.
I should also say as well that for our listeners in other countries, I don't know if this is a cultural thing, but certainly there's some countries where customer service is priority number one, and people would take a dressing down.
I don't know.
I remember public. In some places,
I've been to bars in America, and the bouncers are exactly the same as they are here.
Yeah, what I just mean is that there might be places where people would think, well, you know, it depends how he spoke, but whereas I'm just saying that, at least in my experience of nightclubs in Glasgow, like you just don't get away with that.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, soon after this, Jeannie sees Helen's John showing Helen what looks like some kind of official identification. Helen, on seeing it, appears to be impressed and surprised, but when Jeannie leans in to take a look, He snatches it away and says, "Do you know what happens to nosy folk?"
Oh, Jesus.
Jeannie would never get the chance to ask her sister what the card said. Leaving the Barrowlands, the four of them walk towards Glasgow Cross. At a certain point along the way, Castle Milk John parts ways with the others. He tells them he's going to catch a bus at George Square, bids everyone good night, and leaves the group. And he exits our story. Aside from Jeannie and Helen, this man, who is not believed to be involved in the crimes, had the most interaction with the suspected killer that night. There's no suspicion of wrongdoing on his part, but there is no understating how hugely valuable his memories of that night would have been. And later on, police would make appeal after appeal for Castle Milk John to come forward. He never has. He has never been identified. So, Jeannie, Helen, and the remaining John get into a taxi together. They're heading west. Helen lives in Earl Street down the White Inch end of Scotstoun. Jeannie lives further west on Kelso Street in the Knightswood area, just south of Alderman Road. That will mean something if you're from Glasgow. If not, just know that Helen lived a 20 or 25 minute drive west of where they got the taxi. Jeannie lived a further 5 or 10 minutes out. Jeannie didn't recall John saying where he lived, although in the course of conversation he did mention some pubs in Yoker, which is only another 5 or 6 minutes drive from Jeannie. In any case, the woman's assumption seems to have been he lives somewhere out past Jeannie and he's sharing the taxi to get home. Alright? But a strange thing, and I'm not sure if this occurred to Jeannie or Helen at the time, it certainly would occur to Jeannie afterwards, is that John directs the driver to go to Kelso Street and then Earl Street, dropping Jeannie off first, even though the other way round, dropping Helen off first would be the shorter overall route. In other words, he was already planning, at this point, to get Helen alone in the taxi. Now, Jeannie does start to get the sense that John is irritated by her presence. He becomes more morose, cold. The superficial charm he had been presenting all night starts to fade away on the cab ride, almost as though he's getting tired of putting on a facade.
The mask is slipping.
Yeah, it really does. At one point, he pulls a packet of Embassy cigarettes from his jacket pocket and he offers one to Helen, who takes it. But he completely blanks Jeannie, who he knows tried and was unable to buy cigarettes just a few minutes earlier. A man who previously said he didn't smoke pulls out cigarettes, shares them around, purposely omitting the one person for whom he had just made a huge scene in the dance hall because she wasn't able to get cigarettes. I mean...
Yeah, that's almost like he's kind of, he knows he's like deliberately trying to punish her.
Yeah, it's weird behaviour. It's the contradictory nature of it as well. Jeannie calls him out on this. It's not a Glaswegian trait to let rudeness go unchallenged. And he, quick as a flash, pockets the cigarettes, refuses to give her one. Very weird, very weird.
Yeah.
Jeannie starts to feel uncomfortable, so she tries thawing John with small talk. When she asks him about his work, where he lives, he gives cop-out, cagey kind of answers. When asked what football team he supports, always a burning question in Scotland, he bats it aside by saying he prefers golf. And then when she asks him about golf, he says, I'm terrible at golf. In fact, he makes several of these almost maybe inconsistent statements, maybe intending to confuse, or I don't know, is he struggling to keep track of lies? At one point he mentions a sister, he mentions his father a few times, then later he hits out with, actually I grew up in foster homes. When the topic of religion comes up, he announces, seemingly contradicting his use of Bible quotations, "Oh, religion's claptrap, I'm an agnostic." And yet, when he's asked about New Year, his response is one of utter seriousness and intensity. "I don't drink on Hogmanay, I pray."
That's so bizarre.
It's really bizarre.
It's almost like, I hate to say split personality, but it's almost kind of like he's in two modes of thinking. It's like when he's in the dance hall, he's got one mode of thinking that maybe is very chivalrous.
Yeah.
And then once he's out of that, if you wanted to, you could suggest that maybe it's not a character. Maybe this is some sort of personality fracture. But I know how rare that is in actual reality.
Mm-hmm. The most chilling exchange, I think, occurs when Jeannie, I think grasping for like a nice, safe, neutral subject, asks him, "Do you like dancing?" Now, unusually for a man who spent all night dancing at a dance hall with married women, it turns out this John character isn't a fan of dancing, isn't a fan of dance halls, and he certainly isn't a fan of married women dancing at dance halls. He launches into a tirade about how much he disapproves of adulterous women attending these dens of debauchery. And Mike, I'm not trying to make light of this scenario, because what it's all building up to is about as dark and tragic as it gets. But this situation in the taxi, if I was in that taxi, I'd be thinking, this John is a broken biscuit of the highest order.
Yeah.
I think what that behaviour signifies, it's like he's already building himself up into a frenzy. And unfortunately, I think we can all guess how that frenzy ultimately manifests itself. The taxi drops Jeannie at the roundabout on Alderman Road. I think she's not over the moon about leaving her sister with this guy, but she does. And in fairness to Jeannie, there's a taxi driver in there with them. Helen's house is only about 5 minutes away, and the driver's going to drop her right at the door, almost. And her husband is home, so even if John is a weirdo, he's not going to have much opportunity to do anything, you wouldn't think. As Jeannie gets out, she turns back and starts to say to Helen, "I'll see you next week." But John slams the door in her face and the taxi drives off. That was the last time, the last moment Jeannie would ever see Helen. And it ended with her sister's killer cutting off their goodbyes mid-sentence.
Yeah. It's also, like, I've read about a lot of different serial killers, and that's quite a memorable thing.
Yeah. It's poignant as well, because it's the last moment they would ever see each other.
Yeah, he's like doing more than just cutting off the word.
Yeah. So, the taxi driver later confirmed that he did drop his remaining 2 passengers off at Earl Street, a minute's walk, maybe less, from Helen's front door. He recalled that John paid the fare, and as he did so, Helen got out of the cab and immediately walked away. Bear in mind, she was probably expecting him to carry on in the taxi. The driver remembered that John seemed annoyed by this, and exited from the cab to follow her. The cabbie assumed they were husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend. He didn't really think much of it. He had no way of knowing that the woman exiting his cab would be found the next morning in the rear courtyard of a neighbouring block of tenements, strangled, raped, battered beyond belief. He had no idea he was now the last person other than the killer to see Helen Puttock alive. But it wasn't the last anyone would see of our John that night. At 2 a.m. on Dumbarton Road, at the junction with Fortrose Street in Partick, which is in the same general region of the city but about 30 minutes walk from Earl Street. Half an hour's walk sounds far, but if you follow Dumbarton Road on foot directly from the crime scene on the straightest route towards the city centre, this is exactly where you would end up. The driver of a night bus picked up a now rather bedraggled looking man matching John's description. His smart clothes were spattered with mud, his face was badly scratched, possibly beginning to bruise, and his shirt sleeve was hanging open. He kept trying to hide the torn sleeve up the arm of his jacket. He got off the bus. A lot of sources confusingly state that he got off at the junction of Dumbarton Road and Derby Street. In fact, Dumbarton Road has already become Argyle Street by the point it intersects with Derby Street. That means he was last seen in Finniston, just up from the 78, roughly where the Kelvin Grove Cafe and the Sandyford Henderson Memorial Church are. Basically on the Finniston Strip, if anyone out there knows Glasgow. And it's there that the trail goes cold. Bible John disappears back into the darkness. For a while anyway. Because although this was the end of the canonical Bible John series, the end of the Barrowland killings, it's entirely possible, at least it's one possibility and a good possibility, that this unknown man did go on to kill again, elsewhere and with a slightly different MO. And that is something we'll be discussing in part 2, when we look at some of the potential suspects in the Bible John case. And don't think because we've talked about the 3 known victims of Bible John that the unpleasant side of this story is over and done with. When we get into some of those other suspects, let's just say that unfortunately the body count here is just getting started. We'll also pick up with the immediate aftermath of Helen Puttock's killing, the police investigation that followed it, the largest manhunt in Scottish history, an investigation that encompassed the globe, and we'll delve deeper into some of those weird secondary mysteries that surrounded the case. Hopefully part 1 hasn't been too grueling. Well, I mean, it's grueling stuff and we should be disturbed by it, but I think that there's a healthy level of being disturbed by things like this. Hopefully it hasn't been too distressing, shall we say. Why do we do this to ourselves, Mike?
I don't know. It's terrible, isn't it? On one hand, you and I have talked about this before. I was going to say off camera, but outside of the podcast about this feeling of fascination about things, about the extreme things in life. And I think that's where you can be fascinated. I think that's why we do Talk Until Dawn and we cover things. Yeah, we do some true crime cases, but we also do folklore and we do, other sort of paranormal mysteries and things like that. There are these extremes of life that are so different from our day-to-day lives that just the human mind is driven by curiosity, and that curiosity leads you to want to glimpse that periphery. But
that's a great way of putting it, I think.
Yeah, but God forbid if you ever find yourself on the periphery, as some people sadly do.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound like... I know there are some very troubled people out there who idolise killers, but I think for most of us, to me, it's like it's being interested in the things that scare us.
Yeah.
I don't think that's prurient necessarily. I think as humans we feel the need to learn about the threats in our environment. That probably goes back to the caveman being interested in the bear or some shit, My take is, as long as we remember and give respect to the victims, as long as we don't glorify the acts, and as long as we're not offering publicity to the type of criminal who very clearly wants that, then I think we're on the right path. That last one is kind of a personal preference. There are a few murderers just off the top of my head who would make for great episodes, but I don't think I would ever do them because very clearly they did what they did because...
that's what they wanted.
Yeah, they got off on the infamy. I don't want to...
That's the controversy that's been surrounding that documentary, Don't Fuck With Cats.
Exactly.
On Netflix.
I loved the documentary.
I watched it, but, afterwards when people pointed out that the whole point of that killer was that he wanted to be known, he wanted interest.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, as interesting as that documentary was telling this terrible account, it also it's given him something. There's no way he's not sitting in prison.
Oh, he's loving it.
Loving the fact that they've made a documentary about it.
I'm not going to say his name, but he was front and foremost in my mind when I said that. I don't really want to feed any egos, or I don't want to feed the dreams of any broken biscuits out there who might be heading down that path.
But one of the things as well is that when we're doing Talk Until Dawn, we tend to focus on things that have a mysterious aspect to them. So I'm sure there will be cases that we look at that have been solved because they maybe have some other mysterious aspect or bizarre aspect connected to them. But for the most part, if you look at the things that we're looking at, the reason we're doing that is because there's no concrete explanation and we're not focusing on the killer in a lot of ways in that way, and we do try to talk about the victims as much as possible.
Definitely. And it really is their story, isn't it? The tragedy is theirs, and it's not... I never want to sound like we're making the killer the heroic protagonist in this, which I think sometimes true crime literature sometimes does, whether purposely or accidentally.
An outlaw, they get seen as that romantic outlaw by some people.
When it's someone like Elmer McCurdy, maybe. When it's someone like Bible John, not so much.
I'd romanticize about Elmer McCurdy any day of the week. Not in terms of that sounds like I have a crush on him, but you know what I mean. Like his story, if you haven't listened to it, is an amazing story, and it's very sad. but he didn't seem to be a brutal person.
What was that, episode 4 or something?
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, before we go, shall we say a quick hello to some of the people who've taken the time to write to us and share our episodes and review us on various platforms. Paul's mom, 112503, wrote us a really lovely review, and she said at one point that she could listen to us read the back of a cereal box.
That's the next podcast, man.
Yeah, she jokes, but I did momentarily think that would save us so many hours of research. Might not be as scary until I get to how much sugar's in your Cocoa Pops, but thanks, Paul's mom, for writing that. That's a really lovely note. I'd also like to thank Original Stephen, Gazmats or Gazmataz, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Ad Noctum. They all also wrote us some great reviews. We've not had a bad one yet, I don't think. Probably jinxed it.
You've just totally jinxed it. You've totally jinxed it.
Listening to these arseholes every night cured my insomnia.
And we've had a lot of lovely comments on the Ghastly Tales YouTube channel where we post some of the episodes as well. Yeah,
we've had some great discussion on YouTube. We've uploaded some of these episodes to the Ghastly Tales YouTube channel. Kind of a cross-promotion thing. If you're not familiar with Ghastly Tales, it's a YouTube channel where Mike, sometimes myself, and our friends do narrations and short films and various horror-related things. Hello to Madame Raven, Heidi, Paula Unger, Save Net Neutrality Anti-Republican, that was the guy's name, I don't know. Salome Alfdis Lokidottir.
It's easy for you to say.
Probably butchering that one. Laura Henriksen, Gianni Spagnolo, and everyone else, thank you. By the way, if you're hearing this on YouTube, you should know we don't post everything we do for Talking Till Dawn there. And when we do, it's usually weeks late, so come on over to the podcast, come on over to the dark side if you want to stay up to date. Keep the reviews coming, keep the comments and the likes coming, keep sharing the podcast with your friends, and hey, tweet us. We've not had any action on Twitter, guys.
I know. Scandalous.
Tweet us at TalkingTill, TalkingTill. Send us your tip-offs for weird stories, your comments, your hate mail, whatever. I know I hardly post on there, but that's only because no one reaches out to us on Twitter. It would be cool to make that a secondary source for weird news and stuff like that. But
thanks to everybody that's been listening, and you know we've now had over a couple of thousand downloads. We've had I think a few thousand views on YouTube across the Talking Till Dawn videos that we've posted. So just thanks very much to everyone that's been supporting the show. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, I think it took us up to like episode 9 to reach 1,000 listens, and then episode 10 we were at 2,000 listens. So
splendid.
Things are going good. Things are going well. But keep sharing us. We'll be back very soon with episode 2 of. I've written episode 2 of Talking Till Dawn. That doesn't make sense. We'll be back soon with episode 2 of Bible John, Scotland's unknown serial killer. Till then, take care and get some sleep, because guys, the sun is coming up.
Bye for now.
Good night.